Generally speaking, crime is a phenomenon that is primarily urban, and the worst aspects of it tend to be modern, or at least that's what most people think. Crime rates are traditionally much lower in rural areas of the United States, even in some of the most economically depressed regions such as Appalachia, which was even more true in the early 20th century. The subcategory of mass murder was especially rare before the 1960s. Charles Whitman's assault on the University of Texas campus in Austin, Texas in 1965 is generally thought of by scholars as the first case of mass murder in the modern era. Whitman's massacre was the first in the line of many mass murders that have included family annihilation, school shootings, and workplace massacres. But crime still takes place in small towns and did well before 1965. Occasionally, some small towns were even rocked by mass murder. On a cold spring day in 1920, 8 people were found shot and hacked to death on a farm outside the small farming town of Turtle Lake, North Dakota. The predominantly immigrant community of the area was shocked by the discovery, with many of the residents wondering if they made the right decision by coming to America. An understaffed and underfunded sheriff's department poured all of its resources into catching the killer of the family, but in the end the killer led the police right to him through a mile-long trail of circumstantial yet incriminating evidence. The road that brought farmer Jakob Wolf and his family to their violent demise on April 20th, 1920, was certainly a circuitous one that was full of many twists and turns. Jakob and his wife Beata were born in the Volga region of Russia and raised in a community of German Russians known as Volga Germans. The Volga Germans were first invited to Russia by the Empresses Catherine II, more commonly known as Catherine the Great, to tame the wild lands of the Volga region. Despite the substandard soils of the region, the Volga Germans applied their work ethic and farming experience to make the region productive, and their numbers grew. But the Volga Germans soon learned how difficult life in Russia could be. They suffered raids by Tatar bandits and were subjected to the capricious nature of the Tsars and then the Bolsheviks. Because of these man-made problems, the Volga Germans began immigrating to the United States, Canada, and Argentina in the late 1890s for greener pastures. Many of the Volga Germans settled in the US Plain States, which they found to be very similar to the Volga region in terms of climate and soil. Many of the men worked on the railroads until they saved enough to buy land and then sent for their families. As they did in Russia, the Volga Germans developed tight-knit communities that were high in social trust and religious convictions, yet low in crime. The Volga German communities in the United States were somewhat insular and clannish, but not near the level as they were in Russia. The Volga German immigrants learned quickly that their American neighbours were friendly and helpful if given a chance. Jakob Wolf was drawn to a rural stretch of land about 45 miles north of Bismarck through some of his friends and relatives from the Volga German colonies in Russia. He was told about how cheap land was and that it was much more fertile than what they were used to farming in Russia. Wolf was particularly intrigued by how little the government interfered with farmers in America. Wolf moved his family to North Dakota, bought the stretch of land he was told about, and promptly set about to grow his family and build a successful farming business. Like most of the Volga German immigrants, no matter their sectarian affiliation, the Wolf family was large and always growing. On April 20th, 1920, the Wolf family was comprised of 41-year-old father Jakob, 36-year-old mother Beata, 12-year-old daughter Bertha, 9-year-old daughter Maria, 7-year-old daughter Edna, 5-year-old daughter Lydia, 3-year-old daughter Martha, and 8-month-old daughter Emma. The large size of Jakob's family was a symbol of success among the Volga Germans, but so too was his success as a farmer. Jakob Wolf possessed the lucrative combination of a green thumb and financial acumen. He knew when to plant his crops, where to plant them, and when to harvest, in order to maximize the yield and therefore the profits. Wolf also seemed to know when to expand his business, and was eventually able to hire a 13-year-old boy named Jacob Hoffer as a full-time hand. Most in the community came to respect Wolf as a good father and husband, and an excellent farmer and businessman. But despite the strong community bonds and pious nature of the Volga Germans, they were also susceptible to the human emotion of envy. Not all of Jakob Wolf's neighbours respected his success. Jakob Wolf got along with nearly all of his neighbours, and was well liked in town by both Volga German immigrants and generational Americans. He was seen as a good family man and an excellent farmer who would be willing to help most anyone. But some people seemed to harbour resentment toward Wolf. One man who truly had an axe to grind with Wolf was another vulgar German immigrant named Henry Leyer. Leyer was angry because Wolf's dog bit one of Leyer's cows, and although that would seem like something that could be easily fixed, Leyer escalated the conflict over the course of several days. A few days before April 22, Leyer confronted Wolf on Main Street in Turtle Lake about the dog-biting incident. According to witnesses, Wolf apologised for the attack and offered to work something out, but Leyer was too irate to listen to reason. Some other men had to defuse the situation, and both men went their separate ways. But Henry Leyer was the type of person who couldn't let things go. It also didn't help that he was clearly envious of Wolf's farming success. The details of the events that transpired at the Wolf farm on the morning of April 26, 1920 will forever remain in question, but the local police were able to reconstruct the chronology based on available forensic evidence and statements given by Leyer. On the morning of April 22nd, Henry Leyer drove to the Wolf farm to confront Jakob about the dog attack. Wolf allowed Leyer into the house, but immediately regretted his decision as the two men became engaged in a heated argument. Sensing that the situation was about to get out of hand, Wolf grabbed his double-barrel shotgun from a corner of the kitchen. Leyer made a move to grab the gun from Wolf and a struggle ensued. As the two men fought for control of the gun, both shells were fired, killing Beata Wolf and Jacob Hoffer, who were in the kitchen at the time. Jacob Wolf then made a dash for the door and Leyer scrambled about the kitchen looking for more shells. After a brief yet frenzied search, Leyer found the shells, reloaded, and ran outside, shooting Jacob Wolf dead. At this point, Leyer was in a killing frenzy and couldn't be stopped. He noticed two of the Wolf girls run to the barn, so he followed them in and shot and killed both. Leyer saved his most heinous acts for last when he went back into the Wolf house. He found 3 more of the Wolf girls hiding throughout the house, and mercilessly shot and hacked each one with an axe. He then dragged all of the bodies in the house into the basement. After surveying the carnage he left in the house, Leyer went back outside and dragged Jakob's body into the barn. He then covered all 3 bodies in the barn with dirt and hay. Although Leyer's massacre of the Wolf family was certainly methodical, he missed baby Emma sleeping in her crib. When news of the crime was first reported by the press, many people thought that the killer had a pang of conscience and refused to kill the baby, but it was later revealed that Leyer simply missed her. He would have killed her if he saw her. The farmhouses in southwestern North Dakota are far enough apart that one would have to be listening specifically for gunshots to hear them. Also, a few gunshots would not be out of the norm in rural North Dakota, especially in 1920, so nothing was reported until the next day. When the next day came, some of the Wolf's neighbours noticed that their laundry was still on the clothesline from the previous day. The neighbours thought it was strange because Beata Wolf was an immaculate housekeeper who would never leave her family's laundry on the line. There was also no visible activity around the Wolf's farm, which was strange since there were so many family members and there was a lot of preparations to be done for the beginning of the planting season. Neighbour John Kraft had decided to drive over to the Wolf house later in the day. He was horrified when he found all of the bodies and surprised to find baby Emma hungry and cold but otherwise all right. The McLean County Sheriff's Department suddenly found themselves confronted with a case of mass murder. When McLean County Sheriff Old Stefferud learned of the massacre just outside Turtle Lake, he knew that he had to work quickly to solve the crime. Stefferud didn't have the luxury of modern forensic technology, nor the big budget of a major city's police department, but the Scandinavian-American investigator did possess the straightforward, pragmatic nature that was, and still is, so common in that part of the country. Stefferud knew that he could solve the case through good old-fashioned police work. The sheriff's police intuition told him that the perpetrator was not your average run-of-the-mill criminal. Nothing of value appeared to be missing from the home, and the level of violence didn't fit the MO of any criminals he knew in the area. Stefferud deduced that the killer was someone who knew the Wolfs and had some type of personal grudge against one or more members of the family. He also believed that the killer was not a seasoned criminal and probably made, or would make, a number of mistakes, such as returning to the scene of the crime. To test his theory, Stefferud decided to do a stakeout of the Wolf farm by waiting in the house. Earlier in the day, Stefferud drove to the Wolf house and parked his car around the back where it wouldn't be seen from the road, or if a car drove up the driveway. He then went into the house and waited in the house in total darkness. After a few hours of waiting, a tired Stefferud noticed a car coming down the driveway to the house. A male driver got out of the car and began looking in the ground floor windows. The sheriff crept quietly out of the house and snuck up behind the peeping Tom. "I'm the sheriff," said Stefferud in a flat yet firm voice. "My name's Stefferud. Who are you?" "Leia," the window peeker replied. "Henry Leia. I live not far from here. Isn't this a terrible thing?" The sheriff said little more to Leia, but immediately put him at the top of the suspect list. Leia's visit to the crime scene may have been written off by the investigators as a macabre field trip, but a number of other things he said and did in the weeks after the murders made him look even more guilty. Almost immediately after the massacre, Henry Leia inserted himself into the investigation. Leia routinely visited the sheriff's department office to ask about progress on the case, and to offer his insight, no doubt to put the investigators on the wrong track. As Leia was attempting a campaign of subterfuge, the police learned of his conflict with Wolf. He told Stefferud that the disagreement between him and Wolf was a minor, everyday type of conflict that farmers often have, and that he harboured no ill will toward Wolf. The investigators may have normally believed Leia's version of the events, but more and more pieces of evidence were falling into place that made Leia look like the killer. Besides inserting himself into the investigation and having a known conflict with Jakob Wolf, Leia acted bizarrely at the Wolf family's funeral. All of the members of the family were put to rest together, with most of the town attending the funeral. Leia was there as well and was noted for his overly emotional histrionics that many thought appeared more theatrical than genuine. Finally, Leia had no credible alibi for the time of the murders. He initially told the investigators that he was with his daughter at the time, but she failed to corroborate his alibi. To the McLean County investigators, it clearly looked like Henry Leia was their man, but even in 1920 they needed more than just a hunch to make an arrest and get a conviction. A possible break in the case came when what was believed to have been the murder weapon was found in a nearby swamp. The gun was the same gauge as the one used in the murders, and it had only recently been dumped at the location, which led the investigators to believe that it was the murder weapon. Unfortunately, no fingerprints could be lifted from the gun, and it was unregistered, so it couldn't be traced to an owner. Sheriff Stefferud once more had to resort to more traditional law enforcement methods to catch the killer. On May 13th, despite a lack of evidence, Henry Leia was arrested for the murders of the Wolf family. Stefferud knew that there was not enough evidence for the charges to stand up in court, so he put all of his effort into exacting a confession from Leia. Fortunately for Stefferud, 1920 was long before the landmark Supreme Court ruling Miranda v. Arizona. There is no evidence that Leia was physically assaulted during his interrogation, but he was denied food and sleep for several hours. Despite the constant badgering by the investigators, Leia continued to deny his involvement in the murders. Stefferud saw that playing bad cop wasn't working, so he decided to use a different tactic. He appealed to Leia's conscience. Stefferud placed a number of photographs of the Wolf family's bodies on the desk in front of Leia in the interrogation room and said nothing. He simply let Leia look at the pictures in order to invoke a response. The tactic worked. Leia confessed to all of the murders in detail, and admitted that indeed the killings were the result of the conflict over Wolf's dog biting one of his cows. In 1920, the justice system moved extremely quick. Leia pleaded guilty to the murders the next day in court, and was sent to the state prison with a life sentence 2 days later. It seemed as though Sheriff Stefferud brought some peace back to Turtle Lake, but there were still some loose ends that were never completely addressed. As with most high-profile murder cases, and certainly one of this magnitude, not everything was resolved when Leia was sent to prison. Not long after he arrived at the state prison, Leia recanted his confession, claiming that he only did so under duress. Although there is certainly some truth to him being under duress, Leia never offered an alternative theory, or why he acted so strangely after the murders. Leia died 5 years into his life sentence. The Leia family was especially hit hard by the case. Leia's wife and children became pariahs in the tight-knit Volga German community, and they had no source of income after Henry was sent to prison. 4 of his children became wards of the state, and 1 died 2 years later in a farm accident. Emma, the lone survivor of Leia's massacre, was sent to live with relatives and by all accounts went on to have a stable, fulfilling life. She married, had a family of her own, and died at the age of 84 in 2003. The Volga German community around Turtle Lake has for the most part assimilated into the larger community, and no one is alive today who could remember the Wolf family massacre, which has helped to heal the wounds. The town of Turtle Lake itself has received a bit of a financial and population boost recently, due to the discovery of oil in the Bakken Formation and the subsequent rush. Few of the men and their families who have moved to the area to work in the oil fields know about the Wolf family massacre, which is probably fine by most of the generational residents of the area. Hey friends, Thank you for listening to today's story. Make sure to click the notification icon to stay updated on all future narrations. I release new videos twice every day at 10 AM and 8 PM Eastern Time. If you have a story to share, please send it to the email displayed on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave an encouraging comment. It really helps me keep bringing you more narrations like this. If you'd like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.